Good morning. The title of today's devotional is His Way of Loving. I have been amazed at the number of times that my mind has come back to those two basic verses of the third chapter of John. And I try never to quote the 16th without adding the 17th. I recently reread one of my favorite books, The Spirit and the Forms of Love, by Dr. Daniel Day Williams. His chapter on love and being should be on the how-to list for every Christian who wants to wrestle with the factors and aspects of love. In this chapter, he has a section called The Categories of Love, which I recommend very highly. Let me quote a couple of the paragraphs from this section. He divides his categories of love into 5 aspects of love. Following are 2 paragraphs from the aspect called freedom. He writes, the second aspect of the categorical demand of freedom is that to love is to affirm and accept the freedom of the other. It is not only the future course of life which holds the risk and promise of the unknown. The other makes his decisions about that future and in that history. To love is to accept another who makes his own decision, including that of the love relationship itself. In loving, I make the history of another's freedom my history. The refusal to accept the other's freedom to be and to decide is a failure in love, for we deny that in the other which is essential to love itself. The decisive point concerning freedom is that if in love we will to be loved by another, then we must also will the other's freedom to love or not to love. Nothing is more pathetic than the attempt to compel or coerce the love of another, for it carries self-defeat within it. That which is coerced cannot be love. Hence, in love, we will that the other give his love freely. At the heart of every human being, at the heart of every human love, there is a dependence upon freedom which cannot be either bought or compelled. Unquote. The very interesting part of Williams' description is when you, as I did, go back and look at what Williams says, how love acts in love, and then ask yourself, as I did God love us this way? And the corollary of that primary question is, did Jesus love this way? If love, true love, cannot be forced in a relationship, as Williams states, did Jesus love without forcing his love in his relationship to people? Interestingly enough, Jesus was always an inviter. He invited his listeners to hear what he was saying. You might say Jesus used the phrase when talking, teaching, preaching, will you consider? And I like that phrase. His parables and stories are all invitations for persons to hear the parable and then to allow them to apply that truth to their own lives. The parable of the prodigal son is such a stunning example of this inviting way of Jesus. Listen to this story and see if you relate to any of the persons in the story. The story is about my Father, Jesus is saying. Do you need to go home to the Father? Will he welcome you if you go home to him? Listen to this story again. This is the way that your Father will receive you. Someday, as you come down the road, you may need to remember this truth about your Father. And it says, do you remember? And the Father, seeing his coming, he runs down the road. He embraces him. He kisses him. He hugs him. And that's the truth about the love of God. Verse 17 is an extremely important verse for us to hear. Jesus did not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world and the people through him. Jesus was always concerned with saving people, not condemning them. To the woman brought by the Pharisees, brought to Jesus by the Pharisees, they said, stone her to death. And Jesus declares not condemnation, but salvation. Jesus' teachings, parables, and sermons are all ways that he invites people to be saved. The road of life is a way to disappointment, sorrow, and grief. Jesus points another way, the way to a relationship with God. Or sometimes when we're on a treadmill, we will remember that Jesus said, you will never get anywhere going this way. I don't want you to be disappointed someday. So Jesus invites his listeners to the true way, the way to a growing faith in God and a continuing relationship with God. I invite you, when you read the Gospels, to see Jesus anew. Look at the ways that Jesus loved and cared, and also note that he does not compel people to follow him or his way. He invites persons, just like you and me, to find love through his way of loving, to believe in his way of loving, and to live out in our lives his way of loving. May it be so for you and for me.